Picture this. A rusted-out classic coupe rolled into the auction house on a flatbed. Tires flat, the frame heavily dented right along the left rocker panel. A long crack across the windshield caught the harsh yellow overhead lights, looking exactly like a streak of frozen lightning. Long ago, the body boasted a deep blue. Now most of that color had blistered away into ugly patches of rust and primer. The original chrome trim around the headlights was completely milky with heavy corrosion. Taped to the cracked glass, a red sign labeled the vehicle as scrap metal only, setting the starting bid at a mere $700. The auctioneer was a heavy man with a thick Detroit accent. He leaned into his microphone, clearly explaining that if no buyer claimed the muscle car today, it would get dragged to the scrapyard before sunset. The shallow crowd laughed. Several dealers just checked their shiny watches. One guy up front, a flashy broker in a fancy wool coat, muttered that $700 was pure charity for this rusted junk. Another agreed, joking this barn find would make better cinder blocks than a ride. Everyone there treated the ruined coupe like a total joke. A pathetic, sad ending. A useless relic that had completely worn out their limited patience. But standing in the back was 29-year-old Nathan Caldwell, broad through his tired shoulders. He wore a faded work jacket that still smelled strongly of old motor oil. His 6-year-old daughter, Zoe, held his rough, calloused hand tightly and clutched a worn stuffed bear right against her chest. Nathan totally ignored the printed auction sheet in his hand. He just stared into that open engine bay, his pulse hammering in his ears. Because right before the auctioneer slammed that rusted hood back down, you and I know he spotted what the flashy dealers were too blind to see. Zoe quietly tugged his sleeve, whispering that their apartment rent was due this Friday. Nathan didn't say a word. His sharp eyes were locked onto a faint cluster of letters near the engine block, hidden beneath 30 long years of heavy rust and grime. He slowly raised his bidding paddle. The entire room turned. Then they started laughing. Those arrogant fools had no clue. The man they mocked had just uncovered a rare secret worth more than every single vehicle on that lot. Nathan Caldwell was exactly the kind of man superficial strangers completely ignored. He stood just over 6 feet tall, built with the broad shoulders of someone who spent his whole life working under heavy chassis and auto benches. His dark brown hair stayed short, while his face carried the quiet calm of someone who realized very early on that complaining changes nothing. His rugged knuckles were permanently stained dark, from decades of thick grease that no fancy soap could ever scrub away. He had no fame, no wealth, and 0 shiny university degrees to flaunt. But among the real mechanics on the gritty edge of Detroit, Nathan carried a solid, quiet respect. The man could look at a beaten motor and read its real story, like a master tracker reading snow, easily spotting the welds, the casting marks, the wrong bolts, the honest work. You and I could learn from that vision, and all those repairs buried out of sight. Nathan wrenched at a tiny garage, taking the wrecks and rust buckets those shiny shops wouldn't touch. These orphaned cars arrived on flatbeds, carrying sketchy paperwork that rarely matched their license plates. His pay was slim, his clients' wallets were slimmer. But Nathan always worked with patience. He never faked a repair just to pad the bill. He never rushed a fix that demanded real time. His dad taught him that a mechanic's reputation wasn't built on flash, but earned slowly, one completely honest invoice at a time. His personal life, however, was a rougher ride. Little Zoe's mother packed up and abandoned their apartment when the kid was barely 2 years old. It left Nathan playing both dad and breadwinner in a brutal city that never discounted rent for heartache. Zoe was deeply perceptive, the way kids become when forced to read a struggling parent's mood way too early. She felt her worn-out shoes pinching her toes, but she never begged for a new pair. She knew her dad lied when he claimed he wasn't hungry, especially when they only had one warm dinner plate left to share. She knew the landlord called twice that month, hearing her dad drop his voice into that quiet, panicked tone adults use. The exact tone people use to shield a child from ugly financial truths. Tucked away in the corner of their cramped living room sat an old wooden chest passed down from Nathan's dad. Inside sat dusty notebooks filled with sketches and faded photos of test engines, plus old newspaper clippings detailing secret racing programs that completely vanished from public memory. Back in the late 90s, Nathan's old man turned wrenches for an obscure private racing crew. And even though nobody knew his name, he worked on legendary muscle car engines the public was never allowed to witness. One of the rare stories he shared with Nathan most frequently involved a mythical prototype known as the Sterling 12R, a 12-cylinder beast the clueless media assumed was destroyed in a tragic warehouse fire before ever spinning a single tire in competition. Most superficial mechanics called it myth, but you and I know for Nathan it was inheritance. His dad claimed that truly valuable engines never needed a flashy logo to prove their worth. You spot their true value entirely by how perfectly the welds were laid, by the quality of the cast metal, and where the secret serial numbers hid. That specific wisdom chased Nathan right into his adulthood. And on that freezing afternoon inside the crowded auction hall, it snapped back into sharp focus the exact moment the loudmouth auctioneer flipped open the hood of that worthless-looking, rusted coupe. To the fools in the room, it was pure scrap. The auction catalog labeled it severely wrecked, mechanically dead, lacking original paperwork, and strictly offered as junk metal for parts. Its left fender was brutally crumpled. A massive crack stretched across the entire rear window. The cabin reeked of damp mildew, with a dashboard split right down the middle seam. The fuel system appeared completely lifeless, just like the cold silence of a brutal winter storm. Most shallow dealers would walk away without lifting a single wrench. But you and I know Nathan saw past the rust those arrogant dealers judged. Because when that hood went up and dry dust drifted into the harsh auction lights, the real treasure appeared. You and I know most people only see dead rust. Nathan saw brilliant design. He spotted a motor block completely foreign to this vintage coupe. The motor mounts were modified, but no amateur hacked these. Those bracket welds were flawless, beautifully clean, almost surgical. They had the exact precision of a high-end fab shop, one built to push heavy prototypes to the limit. He leaned in close, tracing the intake with his eyes. The metal casting was hand-poured. The rough exterior showed tiny grinding marks, proving human imperfection. But the inner airflow geometry was dialed to the millimeter. This wasn't some cheap backyard muscle car restoration project. This carried the quiet brilliance of a secret engineering lab. And then he finally spotted it. Tucked back near the firewall, hidden under thick old grease. 3 faint characters caught the harsh light. S-12, the exact code his late father tracked, written endlessly in that weathered leather journal back at home. The Sterling 12R, the legendary motor everyone thought burned. The lost third prototype that old auction legends whispered about. The one swallowed by that massive 1998 warehouse fire. Nathan grasped the high stakes instantly. If this was just junk, his rent money was gone. But if this was that ghost engine, one bad move could ruin a priceless piece of car history. Cheap solvents might wash away those precious casting marks. A bad starter wire could fry everything through dried-out seals. And a blind buyer would let this masterpiece get crushed. Let's think about this. The real treasure was hidden under 30 years of dirt. And he only had minutes to choose. Whether to bet every last cent on a wild instinct passed down from a father who passed away 9 years ago. The caller asked for a $700 open, and nobody moved. Some dealer laughed, shouting that even $700 was generous. The auctioneer warned the ignorant crowd that without a buyer, this rare barn find was heading straight to the crusher. Little Zoe hugged her dad's leg, quietly begging him that they didn't need another car. They really just needed rent money. Nathan stared at her. For one agonizing moment, he imagined a bitter future where society judged her poverty, all because he threw away their cash. Then, he lifted his paddle. The caller stopped dead. Everyone spun around. Then the mocking laughter started. That ugly, arrogant sound a crowd always makes when they think they know better than a quiet guy taking a risk. A flashy guy in a custom jacket turned and gave Nathan a deeply judgmental stare. He saw the scuffed boots, the dirty hands, and the scared kid, then flashed a horribly smug, condescending smile. That man was Trevor Maddox. He ran a big classic auto lot out west. You and I both know his type. He made money off deception, not true value. You and I know how crowds judge. Trevor leaned on the rail, yelling that if Nathan wanted a toy, a thrift store was much cheaper. Another blind voice joked that you should only buy that ugly junk by the pound. Little Zoe's cheeks burned red. She hid her face behind a worn stuffed bear. Nathan stayed totally silent. He just held his paddle steady. Sensing cheap entertainment, Trevor raised his paddle to $800 to needle him. Nathan bid $850. Trevor pushed to $900. Nathan held steady. Trevor stared, then laughed. He loudly declared he wouldn't waste another single dime on pure garbage, dropping his paddle in dramatic mock surrender. The heavy gavel fell. That rusted muscle car was Nathan's for $900. His entire emergency fund, emptied from an envelope hidden behind their cheap cereal boxes. By sunset, the ignorant mockery had outgrown the scrapyard auction hall. At his day job, a mechanic scoffed, claiming the boss's blind trust in Nathan was finally going to shatter over this. Even his busy boss pulled Nathan right into the back office, warning him to keep his stupid garbage obsessions out of the schedule. Gossip quickly flooded their block. At the corner grocery store, while young Zoe stood quietly by the metal shopping cart, an old man at the register laughed to the cashier about how the poor kid's father had just tossed their rent money onto a worthless pile of scrap metal. Zoe stayed perfectly silent until they climbed back into the cab of Nathan's rusty pickup truck. She gripped her stuffed bear, watching the blurry street lamps slowly roll by. Finally, in a tiny voice, she asked if that blind man was right, if her dad made a huge mistake. Nathan caught her worried eyes in the rearview mirror. He desperately wanted to just tell her that everything was fine, but he stayed perfectly quiet. He couldn't prove its hidden worth yet, and he absolutely refused to make empty promises to his sweet little girl. He simply told her that he couldn't prove those fools wrong today. But he promised he wouldn't let her down. Stick with me. That night, Nathan towed the barn find behind his apartment building, parking it inside the tiny detached garage he rented for weekend projects. The Detroit air bit hard, while a cheap yellow bulb threw long shadows across the cracked concrete floor. Let's watch closely. He didn't act like those impatient fools would have. He didn't just dump fresh gasoline down the tank. He didn't carelessly crank the engine or even reach for the rusted spark plugs. If that hidden engine was what he suspected, one careless move could destroy a truly priceless piece of automotive history. So he treated this rusted shell not as a project but as a sacred relic. Using a soft brush, he gently swept away decades of blind neglect from the iron. He aimed the harsh work light down so the oxidation cast shadows across the buried serial number. He photographed every factory weld, carefully measuring the exact bolt spacing on the cam covers. He checked the casting thickness against old hand-drawn diagrams inside his late father's notebook. He marked each invisible clue with a strip of masking tape, logging the true value in a small leather journal meant only for his eyes. Picture this with me. Night 3, Zoe wandered out in pajamas, clutching a stuffed bear beneath her arm. She paused by the garage door. Her father was kneeling beside that rusted open hood. His eyes were bloodshot, yet his hands stayed steady. She quietly asked if he was fixing the junker. Nathan shook his head. He told her he needed to understand its secrets before turning a wrench. Zoe stood there and weighed his words carefully. Then she walked over, placing her bear onto the shredded passenger seat. Like the forgotten machine had been lonely for years and just needed a real friend. Her small words hung there, settling with a heavy weight in his chest. He stared at that little bear resting on ruined vinyl. Then he studied the dark, mysterious shape hiding deep under the hood. He realized then, forget the dollar value. This beaten-up car was already teaching his little girl a profoundly beautiful lesson about true worth. That things the crowd quickly dismissed as pure garbage were simply waiting for someone patient enough to look deeper. He dragged his late father's heavy wooden chest from the closet and worked through the old pages line by line. Right there, tucked inside a fragile maintenance log, sat a folded note written in his dad's careful handwriting. Sterling 12 prototype, only 3 units ever built. 2 definitively lost in a warehouse fire, the 3rd unconfirmed. His father always believed one pristine motor slipped out the back door long before the flames caught, stashed away by someone who recognized its brilliance and refused to let it burn. For 2 entire weeks, Nathan chased the truth at night, barely sleeping. He dug through every public archive he could possibly find, tracking Sterling Motors and their forgotten, brief endurance racing dream. He cross-referenced faded photos. He scrutinized rare casting numbers. He even sent letters to a pair of retired mechanics listed on ancient race day rosters. Slowly, the invisible picture finally took shape. Sterling Motors once held grand dreams of dominating the European endurance circuit. But the program vanished after a massive fire. The company swore all 3 prototypes burned to ash. Stick with me here. One buried local newspaper article quietly hinted that the post-fire inventory was strangely incomplete, suggesting that key components were secretly relocated right before the flames started. Nathan pieced together a solid theory that relied on actual choices, not coincidence. A highly discreet independent garage hired by Sterling Motors itself was likely trusted to safely transport their most sensitive parts. Amidst the sheer chaos of that blazing inferno, one brilliant engineer probably made the bold choice to hide that third engine inside a worthless-looking coupe, rather than letting corporate lawyers quietly scrap a masterpiece of engineering. The ugly car traded hands over decades, rotting away in dirty barns and forgotten backyards, until it finally appeared at the auction block as a completely worthless, rusted curiosity. But the legendary motor inside it was never actually destroyed. It was just waiting for us. He compiled the evidence. Pictures of the dusty block, snapshots pulled from his father's trunk, precise measurements of the intake, original diagrams of those engine mounts, the faint S12R serial, a copied forgotten warehouse fire report, the simple handwritten note from his father. He tucked these hidden gems into a plain envelope, mailing them to Sterling Motor Heritage, the historical preservation wing of Sterling Motors. But before any reply, a shallow shadow walked in. We know the type. Trevor Maddox, the same snob who mocked him earlier, now missing that arrogant, superficial smirk. He spoke with a quiet voice now, a fake friendly tone that made Nathan immediately see the trap. Trevor claimed he had reconsidered, pretending to pity a poor single dad's rough situation. He offered to buy the rusty muscle car for $5,000 cash that very night. $5,000 was huge to a father drowning in unpaid rent, a truly massive sum. Little Zoe, coloring quietly at the workbench, glanced up at the mention of that cash. Nathan watched her process it through the hopeful math of a 6-year-old. She pictured new shoes, a winter coat, and the heavy stress leaving her dad's face. But Trevor's sudden warmth was exactly the kind of cheap veneer Nathan deeply mistrusted. A guy who called a barn find worthless one week didn't just become its savior the next without a greedy hidden motive. Nathan refused. Trevor's plastic smile vanished. His tone turned freezing. He warned Nathan to realize what he possessed, because if he couldn't see its true worth, someone else would. Nathan shoved the door closed behind the hustler and locked it. 3 days passed before the phone finally rang from Sterling Motor Heritage. The voice on the other end definitely didn't belong to a low-level clerk. It was the private office of Vivian Sterling herself, the 28-year-old boss running the classic preservation division at Sterling Motors. Vivian altered a room instantly. Let's see how she judges a book by its cover. She showed up at Nathan's humble garage on a rainy afternoon, stepping out of a massive black sedan, carrying the bold confidence of a woman raised entirely inside high-end corporate boardrooms. Surrounded by lawyers, engineers, and wealthy collectors of cars worth more than houses. Her hair fell in a perfectly styled deep chestnut brown, flowing over an expensive tailored cream dress with a sharp collar, topped by a fitted navy blazer. Her sharp heels clicked against the concrete, a sound that made the cracked, dirty shop floor feel instantly smaller and much cheaper. Her dark, judging eyes quickly scanned the thick dust and that beaten pegboard, the bare light bulb, and finally, the poor mechanic in a greasy jacket near his rusted coupe. To her shallow eyes, every single season brought crazy letters from dreamers claiming they had found rare, lost prototypes, and almost all of them were just cheap junk, wildly exaggerated or straight-up forged fakes, based purely on surface appearances. She just saw a broke guy. We know she missed the real treasure. She didn't even try to hide her harsh, judgmental opinion. She coldly explained how her corporate office got flooded with grainy photos of old engines, sent by fools convinced they had struck historic gold. She sharply added that most of those engines, we know people judge fast, they saw scrap in pure imagination. Nathan didn't flinch. He expected that surface-level caution. A corporate heritage director won't risk her shiny reputation on a dirty stranger's rusty hunch. He calmly replied that he never asked her to blindly believe him. He only asked her to truly look. He popped the hood, flicked on his work light, and placed his hidden evidence right on the bench. Vivian skimmed those pages fast, ready to confirm her superficial assumptions and bolt. Then her hands stopped. She hit the page with the S12R photo. Nathan quietly walked her through the truth. He pointed out exactly where that hidden rear bracket weld sat. He explained this placement perfectly matched a secret reinforcement pattern used exclusively on engines, pushing out torque that completely shattered original chassis specs. He showed the hand-poured intake, explaining why no average street tuner would ever sink that much intense labor into a standard trim coupe. He dropped an old 1998 photo of a test bench, revealing a very similar block resting on a steel cradle inside a dark warehouse corner. Vivian stared at that faded photo much longer than she originally intended. Right at the edge, partially hidden and turned away from the camera lens, stood an older man wearing a pocket watch chain and a heavy engineer's jacket buttoned tight at the neck. His face was completely blurred. His posture, though. Let's look closer. It hit her hard, because she grew up watching that exact posture across countless family dinner tables. The blurry man in that forgotten picture might actually be her grandfather, the true founder of Project 12R. The visionary whose priceless dream Sterling Motors judged as a costly failure lost to a warehouse fire. She stood in total silence for a long time. The superficial disdain on her face didn't entirely vanish, but it definitely shifted. Deep caution replaced it. She stopped judging Nathan as just another foolish dreamer. He might actually hold a priceless piece of her family's erased history. Breaking the silence, she cautiously explained she couldn't make any official announcements yet. She needed to bring in a panel of independent automotive experts. He slowly nodded. He expected nothing less. She walked out silently, her shiny sedan fading back into the heavy rain. For Nathan, this invisible waiting became a silent, crushing kind of agony. His landlord mailed a harsh second eviction notice. "You and I know how the world works." His boss slashed his hours, claiming Nathan's head was stuck in rusty scrap instead of his actual daily job. Money dried up, the grocery list shrank. Little Zoe stopped asking for new shoes. She patched her backpack strap with cheap packing tape, proudly pretending it was always meant to look like that. Her invisible bravery made Nathan's chest physically ache. In those darkest hours, he truly started asking himself whether he chased a rusty engineering illusion instead of the real stability his daughter needed. Trevor Maddox, meanwhile, absolutely refused to stop. He somehow heard that corporate Sterling reps actually visited Nathan's grimy shop. The wealthy bidder finally realized his smug behavior at the auction was a massive, costly mistake. So he attacked with paperwork. He filed an ugly complaint, claiming the rusty coupe's title was fake and that Nathan was just trying to pump up the price with lies. He even suggested the auction house accidentally sold a car with a highly questionable, disputed legal history. You and I know a slick lie doesn't need truth to cause damage. It just needed to be loud, so the county launched an investigation. Overnight, this hidden classic car face being locked away as evidence in a petty legal battle. If the car left his garage, Nathan couldn't protect its fragile hidden secrets. A clumsy official might scrub away the exact rust protecting that priceless serial number. The initial outside inspection, it was a complete disaster. Decades of stubborn rust made the entire factory serial number impossible to read clearly. One so-called expert even guessed the metal welds were simply the messy scars of a cheap, long-forgotten crash repair. Another admitted the intake could be a scarce, custom add-on part, but claimed that alone didn't prove it was a Sterling prototype. Vivian's private lawyers warned her that chasing this rusty ghost could easily look like a foolish emotional choice, because her family was tied to that forgotten, buried project. The 12R engine had always been a painful failure for Sterling Motors. It swallowed huge money and gave back absolutely nothing. After the fire, they hid it away in dusty corporate files that outsiders never, ever saw. Vivian was fighting a quiet, deeply personal battle right now. If that hidden motor was genuine, her grandfather's genius would be proven. his pure vision finally rescued from the darkness of corporate shame. But if the rust covered a total fake, the media would brand her a naive boss who let silly feelings ruin smart business logic. The tension hit a breaking point one night when little Zoe, standing right at the kitchen sink, asked her dad in a whisper, "What happens if those fancy experts say you're completely wrong?" Nathan stayed quiet for a moment. He just stared at the towel in his hands. He realized with a sudden and absolutely brutal clarity, "You and I know this wasn't about proving a superficial stranger wrong anymore. It was entirely about keeping a sacred promise to his daughter." He had looked in her eyes and promised he wouldn't fail. Yet the shallow world was lining up its shiny experts, ready to expose him as a total fraud. That ultimate inspection went down right inside Nathan's humble garage. The cramped room felt tiny, packed with all those slick new faces. 2 elite engineers, a historian from the Sterling Vault and a sharp corporate lawyer. And of course Trevor Maddox, the arrogant bidder who forced his way in as the angry victim. "Watch this closely with me." The garage felt like a cold, tense courtroom. One suited engineer suggested they simply pour a harsh, aggressive chemical onto the block to burn the rust off that serial number. Nathan blocked them before the bottle even touched the rag. He spoke with a deep, quiet calm that looked completely unshakable. "You see, that harsh chemical wouldn't just strip the rust, it would destroy the hidden truth underneath." The corporate engineer sneered, annoyed by this careful approach. He asked if Nathan was a simple buyer or some preservationist. Nathan calmly replied that he was the only person here who looked past the grime long enough to actually understand which areas could be safely cleaned and which absolutely could not. After a tense silence, Vivian finally allowed him to try his own careful method. She remembered his deep respect from the very start. Nathan worked with deep care, applying a gentle solution to the metal. He angled a halogen lamp extremely low, casting light almost flat across the iron. Then he dusted the block with a fine powder meant to expose hidden engravings. Finally, he pressed a magnifying glass right against the rusty block. The full serial emerged, S12R Proto 003T. Complete silence. The company historian opened a thick leather binder, brought straight from the Sterling Motors vault. Inside were the original 98 project files, listing 312R engine prototypes. 2 files were clearly stamped in bright red ink, destroyed in a warehouse fire. But the 3rd unit carried a scribbled, handwritten note in the margins, "Unconfirmed destruction." The lost serial number in that binder perfectly matched this supposedly worthless scrap metal. Then Nathan, with a quiet nod from the stunned panel, removed the secondary cam cover with the absolute precision of a surgeon. "Let's look closer." Hidden beneath the dried oil sat a tiny, easily mist-etched signature. The historian leaned in. His whole face dropped. He spun the binder toward Vivian, pointing at a faded roster of automotive engineers. That hidden signature matched the lead designer of the legendary 12R muscle car program. The very man who passed away believing his entire life's work was completely written off as some corporate mistake. He was her grandfather. Vivian clamped a hand over her mouth. The icy composure she had maintained since that rainy afternoon completely melted away. This engine was never just a financial asset. It vindicated a genius her family quietly mourned for decades. He hadn't just chased some crazy phantom. He truly built it, and someone saw its immense value hiding it safely from those flames. Trevor Maddox, who only saw surface rust, stood silent. The guy who laughed the hardest at the auction hall suddenly had zero to say. His arrogant complaint suddenly looked far less like, "You see it, right?" A desperate attempt to snatch a hidden automotive treasure he completely failed to recognize. An appraiser offered a preliminary valuation in a hushed, professional tone. Assuming this incredible authentication held up, this block was the only surviving Sterling 12R prototype in existence with an insurance value over $2 million, a legacy no price tag could capture. Zoe, watching quietly from the doorway, finally stepped forward and pulled gently at her dad's sleeve. She whispered, using that exact same tiny voice she had back at the scrapyard, asking if this meant their rusty classic car wasn't just worthless garbage after all. Nathan smiled, kneeling down until they were eye to eye. He softly brushed a strand of hair from her. He looked at her face, gently explaining this barn find was never garbage. It had just been overlooked and forgotten for decades. Fast forward 6 weeks. Sterling Motor Heritage held a grand unveiling inside the Detroit Museum of Automotive Legacy. The room was packed with wealthy collectors, auto journalists, and the Sterling board members. The classic coupe rested on a low stage beneath soft white lights. Its heavy metal hood stood open. The rare engine sat intact, polished only where decades of dust demanded it. It proudly showed its original serial numbers and the signature on the cover. The vintage body was stabilized, no fake, glossy paint to hide the truth. The metal dents were smoothed out but kept completely visible. Even the heavy rust on the rocker panels was sealed, never scraped or hidden away. Sterling made a choice that defied every marketing instinct. They chose to preserve the hard miles this machine survived. Vivian Sterling approached the podium wearing a sleek black dress, hair pulled tightly back. She stood tall and confident, but her tone was much softer than back at the garage. She did not begin by bragging about the engine's price tag. She started with her own company's massive failure. She spoke very plainly. Sterling Motors almost let a priceless piece of automotive history get crushed into scrap metal, just because its rusted outer shell did not look pretty anymore. She freely admitted that she had walked right into that auto shop fully ready to dismiss everything. She told the silent crowd that the person who spotted this mechanical masterpiece was not a board of experts or some millionaire classic car collector. He was just a single dad standing in worn work boots, a man who saw the truth when everyone else looked away. The entire room turned. Nathan waited near the wall, wearing a pressed shirt and his absolute best jacket. Little Zoe stood beside him in a neat dress, clutching her stuffed bear. He offered no massive smile. He ignored the snobs who had laughed at him before. His gaze stayed locked on his young daughter, who stared back up at him with a look that went way beyond simple pride. It was pure understanding. You and I know she finally saw the world exactly how her father taught her. A private collector instantly offered a massive fortune for the rusted muscle car. Sterling Motors begged to place it inside their permanent historical vehicle collection. Nathan could have easily walked out of that building, incredibly rich by sunset. But we know he never fought for the highest payout. He gave them 3 firm conditions. First, he demanded that the name of the original lead engineer, Vivian's own grandfather, would be formally restored in the company's official record books, earning a permanent spot in the public Sterling Motors archive for everyone to see. Second, he demanded that the rare coupe and its legendary engine must be preserved in their raw truth. Every rust scar had to remain visible, ensuring the vehicle would never become some fake, shiny hood ornament with its real soul erased. And third, you and I both know Zoe had to be present the moment that engine roared to life. We are heading to Sterling's own test track, where she would finally see with her own eyes what real patience and looking past the rust could pull back from absolute oblivion. Vivian agreed without any hesitation. She no longer looked at Nathan like a wealthy CEO judging a lowly mechanic. Instead, she looked at him the way a grateful heir looks. At the very man who saved a priceless legacy from the scrap heap. Trevor Maddox stood in the back of the hall, far away from any microphone, and he finally realized there was no place left in this story for guys like him. 6 months after that reveal, on a crisp morning over at the Sterling Motors test track, the vintage coupe rolled out under its own power for the first time in nearly 30 years. The classic car restoration team kept their word. A handful of scratches on the door were deliberately left untouched. A rough weld bead by the front cradle was preserved exactly how it looked on that fateful day at the scrapyard auction. The paint wasn't sprayed to a fake, flawless mirror shine. It looked like a barn find that lived a hard life and had finally decided to come home. Nathan showed up early with Zoe. She wore a warm new coat, still clutching that same stuffed bear. Nathan rested his hand gently on his daughter's shoulder. He didn't say much at all. He really didn't need to. Vivian Sterling stood nearby. She was no longer the skeptical woman who had walked into his shop expecting a scam. Now, she was watching a priceless piece of her grandfather's legacy return from the shadows. In that quiet moment, she finally understood something. If Nathan had cared about the mocking laughter at the scrapyard, if he had just taken the safe road that day, her grandfather's legendary engine would have been crushed into scrap metal before the sun even set. The engineering crew performed their final safety checks. Fresh oil, clean fuel, good pressure, and a perfectly restored ignition. They asked Nathan to stand by the controls, because he alone saw the true worth of this classic car when everyone else just saw a rusty shape under a tarp. The key turned in the ignition. The engine didn't immediately roar. It coughed, low and rough, like an old man waking up from a slumber that had lasted way too long. People held their breath around the edge of the track. Then the mechanical rhythm deepened. The firing cylinders found their order, and the 12R came alive in a steady rolling thunder, echoing across the tarmac and into the open sky. Some of those same buyers who laughed at the auction stood by the fence. None of them said a word. They were listening to a masterpiece they had dismissed as junk, judging it only by the pound. Zoe covered her ears, but her face completely lit up. She turned and shouted over the engine noise that her dad had heard the car's heartbeat before anyone else did. Nathan crouched down to adjust his daughter's collar. Against the winter cold, he gently replied that his hearing wasn't any better than the rest of those men. He had simply chosen to look closely instead of laughing at the surface. That sentence holds the real meaning of everything he achieved. It was never truly about a muscle car, it was always about people. About working folks dismissed for their cheap clothes, small paychecks, and tired, greasy hands. About all the things called useless just because they lost their shine. It shows us the difference between those who glance and those who study. After the roaring engine settled into a smooth idle, Vivian walked over to Nathan. She didn't thank him the way any normal buyer would. It was the pure gratitude of a granddaughter getting her family history back. She told him what Sterling Motors was planning. They would soon launch a 12R scholarship for young mechanics who lacked the money or the fancy degrees to get into a big university. Mechanics who held real, overlooked talent right in their hands. Nathan didn't need the flashy public praise. Still, he was happy this would finally open doors for other misjudged underdogs. As the morning sun climbed higher, that mocked piece of scrap from the auction now sat proudly on the test track, a quiet symbol. Its faded metal caught the sunlight, the rare engine breathed. The little girl who once thought the vehicle was just pure garbage now leaned against him. She smiled, fully understanding at her young age that the whole room had judged way too quickly. You and I know things get labeled scrap when we judge too fast. And plenty of people get overlooked because they wait quietly until their real value finally decides to do the talking for them.